So there's truth that is being spoken with a Scottish accent, and that is true truth. So before David brings us some true truth, let's read a passage from the Bible. David's asked me to read from the book of Judges, Judges 4, verses 1 to 10, and that is the story of Deborah. So if you have a Bible with you, open it. Otherwise, listen, and it will also appear on the screen. Judges 4. Again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, now that Ehud was dead. So the Lord sold them into the hands of Jabin, king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. Sisera, the commander of his army, was based in Harosheth Hagoyim. Because he had 900 chariots fitted with iron and had cruelly oppressed the Israelites for 20 years, they cried to the Lord for help. Now Deborah, a prophet, the wife of Lapidoth, was leading Israel at the time. She held court under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim. And the Israelites went up to her to have their disputes decided. She sent for Barak, son of Abinoam, from Kedesh in Naphtali, and said to him, "The Lord, the God of Israel, commands you, go, take with you 10,000 men of Naphtali and Zebulun, and lead them up to Mount Tabor. I will lead Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, with his chariots and his troops to the Kishon River, and give them into your hands." Barak said to her, "If you go with me, I will go. But if you don't go with me, I won't go." "Certainly I will go with you," said Deborah. "But because of the course you are taking, the honor will not be yours. For the Lord will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman." So Deborah went with Barak to Kadesh. There Barak summoned Zebulun and Naphtali, and 10,000 men went up under his command. Deborah also went up with him. That's the word of the Lord. I'll now hand you over to David, and he will give you this morning's talk.
Yeah, hi. It's good to be with you. Good to be with you, John, and others who are online as well, and hopefully really looking forward to being back up in Canberra again. I wonder how many people have said that. But it is good to be able to share. And I noticed John's background, and it's just impossibly neat. So I know that it's not for real. I don't think any lawyer was ever that neat. You'll see mine is much more realistic, although my wife sometimes says, "Please remove the whiskey balls from the..." Apologies for that. Where we come to have a look at Deborah, and just there's some, how will I put it, some myths I think we need to deal with. One is that the Bible is opposed to women in leadership. Another myth is a current cultural myth that men and women are the same. Now, we can argue, and we should argue, men and women are equal and are equally human, and we are similar in many things, but we are not the same. Another in our current culture is that sex and gender are interchangeable. And in fact, we're now moving towards a situation whereby they are also completely separate. In other words, that your biological sex has nothing to do with your gender. And I thought maybe in introducing this, thinking about leadership, I would show you some people who are leaders. So the first slide should come up. There's a couple women who were leaders, Boadicea, Queen Boadicea, and then there's Queen Elizabeth, of whom John Knox wrote his book about Elizabeth and Mary, talked about the monstrous regiment of women, the monstrous reign of women, and she didn't like him ever since that, which is understandable, and Knox was kind of out of line on that. And then here's another couple of women who are women leaders. Interesting how a lot of powerful women dress in blue. I'm not sure if you're a female lawyer, whether dressing in blue really is power dressing, but of course Angela Merkel and Margaret Thatcher. Also interesting that often it's conservative, politically speaking, parties that have ended up with women in charge. And then there are these women as well. Or not all women leaders are necessarily good. That is Jezebel, who's the epitome of bad female leadership, and Madame Mao, who, if it was possible, she probably did achieve it, was a more wicked and cruel leader than her husband. And then I thought I'd move on to a couple of Australian leaders. Well, Gladys, I won't say too much about Gladys. She's in effect going through some kind of trial at the moment. So again, notice the blue. But I found this lady fascinating, Dame Roma Flinders Mitchell, who I suspect most of you will know, a devout Catholic who, I mean, she was born in 1913, and I just found her story fascinating. She excelled at university. She was barred from joining the Law Student Society because she was a woman. And so she started the Women's Law Student Society. She was admitted to the bar in 1934 and became a partner in the legal firm of Nelligan, Angus Parsons and Mitchell in 1935, and practiced as a barrister, overcoming the prejudice that law was for men only. In 1962, she was the Australian representative to the UN seminar on the status of women in family law. 1962, she also became the Australian's first female Queen's Counsel. She became the first Commonwealth female Supreme Court judge in 1965 and didn't retire from the bench until 1983. There are many, many other things that you can say about her. She was a committed Catholic. She was made a companion in the Order of Australia and became governor of South Australia, the first woman ever to be appointed to such a position. She's believed to have had a significant influence on the development and reform of criminal law and the promotion of human rights and equality that is still felt today. So those are examples of women in leadership. And now we come on to Deborah, who's an example of women in leadership in the Bible. Let me just say some things about her. If we go to the next screen, you can see here the passage that we read, and just some basic things about her that I hope are helpful for us to understand. She was a prophet or a prophetess, the wife of Lapidoth. She was leading Israel at the time, and leading in that context means judging. Now, you may not want this, but Israel during the time of the judges was led by judges. And they literally held court. Here she held a court under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim. And the Israelites went up to her to have their disputes decided. What's significant about Deborah, and you can read her story in Judges 4 and 5, is in chapter 4, her story is told in prose, and in chapter 5, it's told in song. And she herself wrote that song. So she's a pretty accomplished woman. She's a judge and a warrior and a poet and a prophet and a singer and a songwriter. She is like Samuel. In fact, Samuel and Deborah are the only two about which this is said, that they were both prophets and judges. There are 5 female prophets in the Old Testament: Miriam, Huldah, Noadiah, and the prophetess in Isaiah, which is generally reckoned to be his wife. So for a book that is in a strongly patriarchal society, it is fascinating that we have here a woman who's in effect a political leader and a prophet and a poet. Quite remarkable, actually. And I think one of the things that does immediately is it immediately says, well, hang on a minute. The rather simplistic view that the Bible is inherently misogynistic or patriarchal is wrong. But I think also it tells us a great deal about leadership. Now, one of the things that we can learn is from her name, Deborah. The Queen's, the name means bee. And in the Jewish Midrash, which is the commentary on the Old Testament, they come up with some interesting ideas about this, and I thought I'd share some of them with you. She's called the bee, or the name is appropriate for her because bees follow the queen bee in a swarm. If we go on to the next slide, he'll give you an example of that. You can see that. Here, she's saying from Judges 5, villagers in Israel would not fight. They held back until I, Deborah, arose, until I arose, a mother in Israel. God chose new leaders when war came to the city gates, but not a shield or spear was seen among 40,000 in Israel. My heart is with Israel's princes, with the willing volunteers among the people. Praise the Lord. She had this capacity to inspire and to lead people. And again, that is fascinating. I mean, I'm thinking of some of the leaders. I mean, I do think there's a lack of leadership overall in our culture and in society. I think you'll often find that people who profess to be leaders or in positions of leadership follow the mob or the crowd. And I think you find people who are extremely weak leaders. And I don't really want to go into current, say, politicians or church leaders, but let me give an example from earlier. Angela Merkel was a fabulous leader. And whether you agreed with her politics or not, the same was true of Margaret Thatcher. And she dominated that cabinet largely of men. So the bees follow a leader is somebody who can inspire and who can motivate. The Midrash also says this, that bee's honey is sweet, but a bee's sting is painful. And I think there of Muhammad Ali talking about floating like a butterfly, stinging like a bee. So the idea of Deborah was there was a sweetness in her, but there was certainly a sting and that she had. And then the Midrash also talks about how bees collect pollen and nectar for others. In other words, they serve, they are lowly, they are humble. And so there are great qualities, I think, seen in this. There's strength, there's leadership, there's the ability to inspire and to motivate people, but also a sense of service, a sense of humility. And I think that's how that fits very well. And I think that's how Deborah did judge. Interestingly as well, we're told that she sought the Lord before judging. She prayed before judging. I remember when, was it, yes, Tony Blair and George Bush. Tony Blair, Alistair Campbell, who was Tony Blair's press officer, was asked about whether George Bush and Tony Blair played together, and Alistair Campbell said, "We don't do God, because that would be absolutely appalling." And you can imagine today that, say, if the new Premier of New South Wales or if Scott Morrison said, "Well, I pray before we make decisions," there'd be all the cries in the Sydney Morning Herald of theocracy, theocracy, this is dreadful. But actually, it's a really good thing to pray and to be granted wisdom to try and understand. It reflects a humility. It's not that we're claiming we get, oh, I get divine revelation from God telling me this person is guilty or that person is not. It wasn't that kind of judging. You'll notice also in verse 5 that she held a court. And then the other aspect of this that I find interesting in terms of her leadership and her judgment is that when Barak comes to her, and Barak was basically commander of the armies, Barak says to her, "If you go with me, I will go, but if you don't go with me, I won't go." Now, there are two ways that people have of understanding this. One is that he was quite uncomfortable taking commands from a woman. And that may be true. But I think the natural reading of the text is more that she was seen as so inspirational that she needed to be there. And I think there's another basic principle in there as well, that leaders lead from the front. They don't lead from the back. And again, I think there's a lot of stuff that our leaders can learn from. So let me summarize all this. Let's go on to, I think this is the last slide. A mother in Israel. I put that personally there. That's my mother. She's in her late 80s. She's just managed to work out how to use Zoom and other things, so we're able to communicate with her, which is one of the wonders of technology. But she's very typical of Scottish working class women, worked all her life. In her 80s, she still works. She's still got 100 chickens that she goes out to look after and everything else. And I think these women have been the backbone of our culture and society in many ways. You can lead in different ways. And this phrase, a mother in Israel, I was listening to a debate or discussion on the ABC, and someone was saying, well, it's almost like insulting to speak about women as mothers. And actually, the mother is such an honorable role in that regard. And I think this whole aspect of leadership and everything that's involved, it does involve being human. It does involve your relationships with family and friends. One of the qualifications that the Bible gives for leadership in the church is that an elder has to manage their own house well, because the relationships that we have in our homes are indicative of the relationships that we would end up in the church. But let's come back to this, to Deborah. This is a good motto for any person in a position of influence who is a Christian, and even for those who are not Christians. From Micah 6:8, he has shown you, O mortal, what is good. What does the Lord require of you but to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God? We know that that's Deborah. That's what sums Deborah up: to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. Humility does not mean that you don't lead. We're not talking here about the cringe stuff. Humility is the recognition of your own limitations, and it's just seeking to do the good that you can. And I would argue that ultimately, to do that, you need the help of God. You need the help of Christ. You need to know and to follow Christ. So I think the story of Deborah is fascinating because it breaks quite a lot of stereotypes. I think the story of Deborah is fascinating because there's a lot for all of us to learn, whether male or female. And I think it's fascinating because as a model leader, multi-talented leader, she's a great example to those of us who are involved in public life in any way or have any form of leadership, whether in the secular world or in Christianity or indeed in crossover in that regard. So I'm going to leave it there. And I think we will go on to, if anyone's got any questions or comments, we can do that. And if you wish to ask anything or say anything, feel free. John, back to you.
Thank you, David, for your talk and giving us a little bit of an insight into Deborah. I'm on the Slido right now, and it looks like there have been no questions yet. So you've comprehensively answered everything for everybody. But I had a few questions that arose.
You go ahead.
Particularly when you talked about the way that that Deborah always prayed before going into leadership. There seems to be, and you talked about the hesitance of modern leaders on this front, and the fact that they're absolutely going to get an avalanche of criticism if they talk about their religion. And just recently, Scott Morrison said, when the attacks came on his religion, he said, I have deeply personal religious beliefs, but they never influence my political decisions and my political judgments. What did you think about that statement from Scott Morrison?
I don't think it's true. So that would be my first statement. I think what he was trying to say is, look, I don't go to the Bible and, I don't sort of say, well, should I get nuclear submarines from America? I'm going to open up my Bible and go, do not go to Egypt or something. That I think in that sense, that is true. But I don't think it's true that what is of the fundamental essence of your life and your values do not affect your political judgments. So, for example, I, as a Christian, believe that life is sacred that will affect my political judgments. It will affect how I view abortion, euthanasia, war, and many, many other things. Fundamentally, I think justice, freedom, and so on, these are all values that stem from my Christianity. And I think Scott Morrison has fallen into the secular trap of where what the secularists, not secularists in the sense of separation of church and state, but secularists in the sense of no God in public life at all. What they've done is they've said, sure, you have your religion, as long as it's like you belonging to a line dancing club. Just don't let it affect anything. And actually it does. So if I'm the journalist, I'm saying to him, I'm sorry, Mr. Morrison, but that cannot possibly be true. You have values. Your values come from your faith. And so I think he misspoke at that point, to be honest.
It seems to have been repeated with the new New South Wales Premier Dominic Perrottet, and as soon as he was elevated to the office, criticism came thick and fast of his conservative Catholicism, and immediately there were articles that criticised him for his religion and questioning whether he could legitimately govern on behalf of all people. Where do you think that comes from?
I think it comes from prejudice, and I think it comes from, well, prejudice, I was going to say illegitimate fear, but that's what prejudice is. Prejudice is often based on fear. So I was astounded as an outsider to Australia to, as soon as it was possible that Perrottet was going to become the leader of New South Wales, to watch the pile-on instigated initially by the Sydney Morning Herald, which was ludicrous. I mean, it was, I come from Scotland and we're not unused to anti-Catholicism, but it was anti-Catholic. That was one thing. I think it was fundamentally anti-Christian, though. And I think it was an attempt to intimidate and to influence policy. Ironically, the people who say, oh, you're not going to let your religion or your religious views influence policy are the very people for whose religious views and philosophy determine their policy. Absolutely. Whereas I think with Perrottet, it was fascinating. I mean, I don't know him at all. I know very little about him. So far, I thought he handled it pretty well, but he will come under enormous pressure not to lead according to his principles. There's an interesting story here that kind of indicates what I'm trying to say. I think Peter Hitchens and Christopher Hitchens. Peter Hitchens, at one point when he was an atheist, said, I came to realize that I would rather live in a country as an atheist that was Christian than live in an atheist country. And I remember I got involved in a big dispute or a big fuss with a Scottish gay magazine called Kaleidoscope. And they had written an article attacking me, and I contacted the editor, and he got in touch with me, and he said that he wanted me to write an article. So I did, and I said, you're going to lose your job over this one. Well, it created a huge fuss. I mean, it was by far their most read article ever, and there was a huge backlash against me, but also against him for publishing it. And one of the senior gay activists in Scotland wrote in and said, look, guys, you need to understand this. He said, you need to back off. David Robertson, you need to back off the editor. He said, I've been in his church, and I need to tell you this. I'd rather be governed I'd rather be in a Scotland governed by the Christianity he represents than in any other country. And I think that what we do is we concede too much. I was in a businessman's meeting last night where we were talking about ethics, and the thing that struck me, these very top business people talking about ethics and virtue and everything else, they were just so incredibly confused about where it came from. And I think it's not, I started joking, writing spoof tweets and stuff, just being sarcastic, but a lot of people didn't get sarcasm because I was saying, it's great to be in the theocracy that's New South Wales now, And I'm looking forward to the Catholic Inquisition, and all this kind of stuff. And people took it seriously, and I thought, oh, get a grip, But so yeah, it was interesting, very interesting.
Now we've got a question off Slido. It says,
Yeah.
apologies if I misunderstood. Is the only characteristic that made Deborah a good leader that she prayed for wisdom?
Yeah, no need to apologize, because if you misunderstood it, we always say it's because the speaker misspoke. No, absolutely not. I think you can be somebody who pray and not be a good leader. I remember in political terms, one time I was very involved in politics and was standing for election at the University of Edinburgh. And I remember a Christian from the Christian Union, which I belonged to, came to me and said, oh, you're standing for senior president. I'm going to stand for treasurer. And I said, don't do that. You've not got any political experience. You need to work your way up through. First of all, you need to become a member of the council and all that kind of stuff. And he said, no. And he put out a leaflet saying, vote for me because I'm a Christian, therefore I'm honest. And I go, oh, great. He did me a lot of harm. But I just thought, being a Christian doesn't mean you're going to be a good plumber. And it doesn't mean you're going to be a good politician. So Deborah obviously had qualities other than praying, which made her a good leader. But I would say prayer is essential for certainly for any Christian, and it's a great thing to have. But obviously, she had leadership qualities. She had a certain charisma that inspired people. She was, inverted commas, a mother in Israel. So there was a certain seniority about her. She certainly had guts and gumption, some of the stuff. She had wisdom and insight. She had poetic skills. She's one of these. I'm a one talent person, I think. And you meet people who are just mega talented, who can do everything, and they just make you feel ill, to be honest. But she was one of those. No, it wasn't just that she prayed, but I would say prayer was a key part of who she was, and indeed of how she judged, because the judges were judges under God. This was a theocracy, by the way. Israel at this time was a theocracy, and it was to change. But at that stage, the judges were judging on behalf of God.
Yeah. And it's interesting, David, that the Bible talks about these political leaders as judges. The Oxford academic Oliver O'Donovan has talked about the idea that the Bible talks about government as judgment. In other words, that proper political leadership is more about discernment of truth and judging truth rather than making legislation. Whereas in the West, particularly in the last 100 years, we've seen government, political leadership, as making laws. And
yeah, although I think you do so on you make laws on the basis of judgment. So I wouldn't set the two over as against one another. I think the real problem is when you have it's on what you base your judgments. And I think the danger we are entering into right now is government by opinion poll or government by mob. Whereas a judgment is you look at something and you say, well, so we've got the whole climate change thing just now. So someone's looking at that and saying, okay, I got to make a judgment based upon how much, climate change is affected by humanity, and there are various factors. So the idea, of course, of judgment is scales. And so you're weighing various things in the balance, we can get to net zero by killing every human being. Okay, that's maybe not a good idea for humanity, So you weigh things. It's the same with the COVID stuff. You're weighing things. When New South Wales discusses the euthanasia thing, you're weighing things. And I think that's much better than the kind of absolutist, either what I would call extreme theocracy, or, the king is the law kind of thing, or right now, our liberal progressives, for whom every single one of their beliefs is absolutely common sense, fundamental to everybody, and you've got to come along with it or else. There's no weighing at all. And I think we could do a whole lot better if people really did think about justice in the sense of judging, thinking, weighing, rather than coming in and saying what I believe is the absolute and that's it. I think there is an absolute. I think ultimately why you pray to God, because he is the absolute. I think Richard Dawkins is right. I don't often say this when he says it's without an absolute God, it's virtually impossible to have absolute morality. But I also think that we need to recognize we are not the absolute. And I think that's what Scott Morrison should have said. He should have said, I'm not God, and I'm not taking orders, if you like, thinking that everything I say is, the word of God. But I do base my faith and I do base my politics and life upon the values that I have and that are shared by many.
Yeah. Another question, David, has come through on the Slido. If we profess to relate to a living God, how can we say that it does not affect us more than just the reading of a book?
Well, because there's a contrast there that I wouldn't agree with. So the word of God is living and active. The living God gives us his living word. If you take the Bible as a book of laws or just a history book, then yes, the question is valid. If you take the Bible for what it is, for what it says about itself, that it's the living word of God, then it talks in Peter about having the word of the prophets made more certain. So I don't know about any of you, but I've had people come to me saying, God has told me this, God has told me that. And I'm thinking, well, God never told me anything like that. I don't deny that is possible in quite exceptional circumstances. However, I would be very concerned about being led in a country by somebody who said, well, God has told me that we need to, buy American nuclear submarines. I very, very much doubt it. God has told me that COVID is going to stop in 2 months' time, or I would just for me that would be almost blasphemous, to be honest. I think it would be far away. Our God, of course, is living, and there's a far bigger picture, if you like. We are the pixels. It's a bit like your background, John. There's that can be changed. I think what God does is he shows us the reality, and he enters into our mess, and he works with us as human beings, and we have a living relationship with them. And we say, one of the things about politicians is the immense amount of personal attacks they come under. I think if you're a Christian, you're able to get a lot of strength from your relationship with God and from remembering that it's just not all about you. So, yeah, the question is valid, but I would question the premise that the Bible is just a history book or a law book.
And David, just one last question. What do you think we can take out of the story of Deborah and other women leaders in the Bible about good relations or proper relations between the sexes?
Okay, I think one of the things we need to be aware of is, there are distinctions between male and female, but sometimes we make too much of them. So ironically, it's a bit like our current culture. By focusing so much on racism, we've made it more racist. And, I think the male and female were made in the image of God. So, Paul has this lovely thing about treat younger women as sisters, older women as mothers, and so on. I think someone who's made in the image of God, you treat with respect, you treat with dignity. I think that we treat each human being as individual as well. I have a number of friends who are good and close friends who are women. Not all my friends are male. I don't know. I just think it's wrong to patronize. I think any form of misogyny is wrong. I do think that aspect of respect is really, really important. I also think we need to be very, very wary of sexual objectification. In other words, I'm talking about pornography and other things as well. And it's just wrong. It's just wrong in so many ways. But I would take from this, in one sense, Deborah is exceptional, but then you could argue that Samuel is exceptional. Any leader is exceptional. We didn't get onto the subject of female leadership in church, which I'm glad we didn't. We can discuss that another time. But I do think the thing that comes across to me here is, 1, avoid stereotypes, 2, avoid prejudice, 3, treat every human being with respect. And I actually think society would be a lot better for women if we followed the biblical precepts. Ironically, as our society is moving away from those biblical precepts, and sometimes in the name of feminism, it's got worse. Just let me maybe finish with this. 20 years ago, I remember, speaking at things and, feminists yelling at me and throwing things and all the rest of it. Now I find myself an ally with numerous feminist groups, which I just find utterly bizarre. And that's because the gender studies, queer theory revolution has come all the way around to eat itself, so that women are in danger of being cancelled. When you've got official government bodies, even legal bodies, saying, don't refer to mothers, you can't say that a woman this and a woman that, let's get rid of women's spaces and everything else. I think that's going to be, by the way, one of the it is a big issue already, but I think it's going to be a dominating issue in the next few years. And I think we must stand up and speak up, men and women together in that, for a biblical understanding of what humanity is. So maybe that's where I should leave it.
Well, thanks a lot, David. Thanks for your talk and for your comments afterwards. And thanks also to everyone who's helped out behind the scenes, getting the new Zoom link up and making sure that we could meet together this morning. I hope you as an audience have enjoyed it. Before we close off today's event, I just wanted to bring a couple of things to your attention. First, if we didn't get to your questions, or you wanted to explore the Bible more broadly or engage with City Legal, please spend the next couple of minutes filling in the digital form that's been dropped into the comments section. It will ask you for some contact details for City Legal to get in contact with you, as well as a range of options for you to engage. It has an option where you can join a hope group, where City Legal will set you up with a person or a group of people to explore the Bible in a relaxed and comfortable setting. So please do explore that if you can. In the meantime, we'll say goodbye to you and remind
John,
you...
sorry, before you go, I forgot to say, I should have mentioned this. I know a number of people, the interview and stuff I did with Greg Sheridan, well, part 2 of that is now up on the Ask podcast. So if people, you look for that, you can get it, or if you just go to theweflee.com, it'll be up there. So I just wanted to mention that because a number of people had asked about it.
Okay. Thanks, David. So if you'd like to see more of David, go to the Ask podcast. And David will also be joining us again, Lord willing, in person in Canberra on Thursday, 18th of November. So put that into your calendars now. And thank you for joining us this morning. And we will leave you to commence the rest of your day. Goodbye. God bless.